Welcome to the Read-aloud for Friday, March 27th. Don't forget you're going to need your question sheet. So today is October, part 2. And you have 7 questions. How many erasers were in the box? Where had the chalk fallen? What did they decide to do to Mrs. Biggio? Why does his sister do it? What does Holling owe everyone? How many weeks of allowance will Holling need? What will they read together first? Actually, though, someone did come to the door after everyone had left. It wasn't President Johnson. It was a grade 5 from Camillo Elementary, and he was carrying a box. "There you are, Charles," said Mrs. Baker. "Did you get them all?" "I think so." "From Mr. Petrelli's class and Mr. Samowitz?" Charles nodded. "And did you remember Mrs. Harknett downstairs?" "Yes." "And Mr. Ludema?" "I got them all," Charles said. "Thank you. You may put them here on the desk." Charles put the box on Mrs. Baker's desk. He looked once at me, kind of sadly, I thought, and then left, brushing his hands off. Chalk dust fell from them. "Mr. Hoodhood," said Mrs. Baker, "recent events have led the junior high teachers to conclude that we need to be keeping our chalkboard erasers much cleaner. So I asked Charles to gather them from the classrooms and bring them here each Wednesday." She gestured toward the box on her desk. "Would you take care of them, please?" If there was ever a time to complain, this was it. I walked over and looked in the box. There must have been 30 erasers in there. So that's number 1. And they were all white with 6 weeks worth of chalk. This was really the time to complain. But I thought about the future of Hoodhood and Associates architecture firm. I picked up the box of erasers. "I'll be in the ditto room," said Mrs. Baker. Just swell, I thought. But then Mrs. Baker said something that made the world spin backward. "If we both finish in time, you may have one of the cream puffs." I think I must have gone white. "You needn't look so shocked," she said. But I was shocked. She had offered the hope of a cream puff, a brown, light, perfect cream puff. It was as if Mrs. Baker had suddenly not become Mrs. Baker. It was like I'd had another vision, only this one was real. So, before the vision could fade, I carried the box of erasers down the hall, down 2 flights of steps, and outside. The day was still a perfect blue October day, as if it had been waiting for me since I'd missed it at lunch recess. It smelled of baseball and the last cut of grass, and leaves drying out but still holding on, and for a while I could smell all of it. But the cloud of white chalk that comes out of 30 erasers is pretty impressive, let me tell you. I pounded and pounded them against the wall, and the chalk dust that didn't get into my lungs flew and twisted with the breeze that curled against the first-floor classrooms, coating all the windows. The teachers had learned to close them on Wednesday afternoons. A cream puff. At the end of a long day, brown, light, and perfect, and no one, not Danny Hupfer, not Merrill Lee, and not my tea, no one needed to know. The cloud of chalk dust wafted higher. It flew up to the second-floor windows, which were all closed as well. Maybe Mrs. Baker would give me 2. After all, there were 12 trays of them. Maybe 2 cream puffs. The chalk dust wafted with the swirling breeze past the second-floor windows and then up to the third-floor windows. Maybe she would give me a 3rd cream puff to take home. The chalk dust gathered by the grade 7 windows. Windows someone had left open so the air could circulate. Mrs. Baker's windows. Open next to the brown, light, perfect cream puffs so they wouldn't get soggy. I ran desperately up the stairs, lugging the box of 30 erasers, 23 of which had sent their chalk dust toward Mrs. Baker's windows. But I was too late. The cloud of chalk dust had drifted in, and then gravity had taken over. The chalk had fallen gently upon each one of the cream puffs. And that is number 2. They looked like Mrs. Biggio had spread an extra thick layer of powdered sugar on top. Are you picking out the one you would like? Mrs. Baker came back into the room with a pile of blue dittos. Not really, I said. Well, choose quickly then, she said, and we'll carry the trays down to my car. I picked one up off the tray. It felt a little bit gritty. Then I helped Mrs. Baker carry all the trays down to her car one at a time, hoping that the wives of Vietnam soldiers would not notice the chalk dust all that much. Between trips, I threw my own cream puff into the coat room beside the moldering lunches. You know how a story, you know how a story gets told in a small town, and how every time someone tells it, it gets bigger and bigger until it's a flat-out lie? That's what happened to the story of the cream puffs at St. Adalbert's that afternoon. By the time the story got back to my father, which took only 16 hours since he'd heard it the moment he arrived at Hood and Associates architecture firm on Thursday morning, it said that every single one of the wives of Vietnam soldiers had nearly choked to death while eating cream puffs, which had to have been an exaggeration. At first, according to the story, they had turned on Mrs. Baker, but when they realized that Mrs. Baker could not even imagine pulling a practical joke, they had turned on Mrs. Biggio, who was also one of the wives of Vietnam soldiers. When Mrs. Biggio assured them that there must have been something wrong with the powdered sugar and she would be sure to write to the company to complain, they decided that they would not expel her from the wives of Vietnam soldiers. However, she would never again be their official cook. And that's number 3. At this, Mrs. Biggio had tearfully insisted that the cream puffs were really not that bad after all, and she put a whole one into her mouth, chewed and swallowed. The doctor at St. Ignatius Hospital said that the spell had come on when she refused to let herself cough, even once. So I'll end it there, and the second video will finish the rest of this chapter, or the rest of this part of the chapter.